Hi, and welcome back to another lecture. Today we're going to be talking about Harriet Jacobs. Jacobs is a little different from the other authors that we've encountered so far because she was not writing as a novelist. She was writing a memoir, a slave narrative. Her slave narrative that we're reading was published after two very famous slave narratives. There were obviously more than just these two, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this tradition. There was Olaudah Equiano, who is pictured here on the far left of the screen. He published his narrative in 1789, and it's a very Black Atlantic narrative in that he comes from Africa to the US for a little while, and he gets his freedom in England. So you have that triangle of trade. Frederick Douglass's very famous, very important slave narrative was first published in 1845, and he completely went back to it and revised it and republished a lot of different editions over the course of his life. And then we have Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which we are reading for class. So since we already are familiar with the Gothic tradition, I want to tell you guys in this lecture a little bit about slave narratives so that you could think about how she fits at the nexus of these things. And I'll give you a little bit more context to kind of get purchase on her book. I want to say that it might seem a little bit weird in a class on Gothic literature to include something that's nonfiction, but one of the things that reading Jacobs helps us see is how the Gothic was not just a genre for novels and short stories, but also a technique that writers used to think about the truth. So as you read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, it's not all going to feel Gothic, only little moments are going to feel Gothic, and the way that we think and talk about the Gothic is going to be very different because of that. I'm not familiar with any conventionally Gothic fiction written by Black American writers in the pre-Civil War era. The kind of earliest writing by a Black American writer that I can think of that's about ghosts and sort of spooky things would be Pauline Hopkins, who writes about that kind of thing in her novel Of One Blood and in short stories like The Mystery Within Us, but that's around 1900, 1903, 1904 when she's publishing those things. Certainly there could be other Gothic writing by non-white Americans that I'm not familiar with, and actually the Austen Reed excerpt, which is again another memoir, another true story that even uses haunted in the title, was only recently recovered within the last 5 or 6 years, I think. So we're constantly finding different kinds of writing that show us how writers on the American continent were engaging with things like the Gothic in different ways than what the literary record of things that stayed in print this whole time tells us. So anyway, a little bit of context about the slave narrative. So the slave narrative before Jacobs would describe a series of linear narrative developments. It's told chronologically. It emphasizes truth and authenticity, and a lot of these narratives have letters at the beginning of them that authenticate what's going to come later. This was a convention of the genre, but also a requirement for Black writers to have white people kind of vouch for them and for the truth of their story. The sense of authenticity is established by the inclusion of supporting documents, sometimes both at the beginning and the end of the story. Like I said, almost always at the beginning. It has recurring motifs like whipping, slave auctions, the breakup of families, escape. It's a little funny to call these things motifs because they really happen to people. So it's not like setting a motif in a fiction story that you're writing where you're like, this could be an interesting theme. It's true. But we have to think about these both as narrative and as telling us about the truth of this, you know, uh, torturous existence at the same time, and we have to balance those two thoughts in our head as readers. The quest for freedom is linked to a quest for literacy. So a question that you might ask as you read is, what's different in Harriet Jacobs' incidents? A little bit of background about Jacobs. She was born in North Carolina into relative privilege. You'll see this in her own account of her story. Her struggle for freedom is not linked to the quest for literacy. It's linked to self-imposed imprisonment, and that's where the Gothic element of the story is going to be most pronounced. She draws, this is supposed to say draws on conventions of Romanticist and particularly seduction Gothic literature into her slave narrative. And she uses the pseudonym Linda Brent in her story as she frames incidents to be read like fiction. And that's the biggest difference from Equiano and Douglas. So Equiano, Douglas, and other writers of slave narratives are saying, this is the truth, this is the truth, this is the truth. Harriet Jacobs uses a lot of the techniques of a fiction writer, even sometimes calling out to the reader, oh reader, and that kind of sentimental cliche to sculpt how we feel as we read and judge these characters. So why do you think she did that? I'm not really asking you to reflect on her psychology. That's obviously unknowable. But what are the effects of reading something that's true and cast as fiction? What does that emphasize for you as a reader? How does that make you feel? Those are the kinds of questions you can ask when you have that context. Jacobs dissents from Douglas to a certain extent, suggesting that slavery is worse on women than men. She says at one point, when they told me my newborn babe was a girl, my heart was heavier than it had ever been before. Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. So one of the things that makes this narrative really unique is that it does offer a woman's perspective. Frederick Douglass's narrative does describe his aunt being whipped, and there are moments where he talks about his mother and other women, but obviously we get a different intersectional perspective when we read Jacob's firsthand account of her. It's going to be very obvious how her torture is gendered as you read. This demonstrates the premise of intersectionality, an important concept in politics, law, and critical theory today, first coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw in the 1990s. So intersectionality, if you're not familiar with that term, I really recommend that you Google it along with Crenshaw's name. It's a word that we kind of bandy about now. It's obviously not a word that Jacob would have used. As I said, it was coined in the 90s. But the term comes from an actual the Crenshaw is a legal scholar, and it comes from a case where there was a discrimination lawsuit against an auto company. I think it was Ford. And it was a Black woman who claimed that she was discriminated against. And the defense pointed out that there were women who were employed under fair conditions, and there were Black men who were employed under fair conditions. So she didn't have a claim as a woman, and she didn't have a claim as a Black person. And so intersectionality was coined as a legal term to describe the way that you might be discriminated against specifically at an intersection. So even if you have a workplace that does not discriminate on race and does not discriminate on gender alone, if you are misogynoir and discriminating against Black women, that can be an actual case. So, very different context, but it's useful for thinking about Jacobs and the particular form that her abuses take. Jacobs does not feel Equiano's exaltation to receive her papers. I know you guys probably did not read a lot of Equiano's interesting narrative, but when he holds the papers that announce his freedom, he feels very excited. That's kind of the crescendo, the climax at the end of his story, from bondage to freedom. But Jacobs says pretty much the opposite. The bill of sale, those words struck me like a blow. So I was sold at last. A human being sold in the free city of New York, late in the 19th century of the Christian religion. I well know the value of that bit of paper, but as much as I love freedom, I do not like to look upon it. So I'm drawing this out just to sort of let you know how she's setting herself against the other writers in the slave narrative tradition who came before her. What does Jacobs discuss that does not fit into a conventional slave narrative? Love. She says in chapter 7, why does a slave ever love? Why allow the tendrils of the heart, notice that sentimental language, to twine around objects which may at any moment be wrenched away by the hand of violence? When separations come by the hand of death, the pious soul can bow in resignation and say, not my will, but thine be done, O Lord. But when the ruthless hand of man strikes the blow, regardless of the misery he causes, it is hard to be submissive. I did not reason thus when I was a young girl. Youth will be youth. I loved and I indulged in the hope that the dark clouds around me would turn out a bright lining. So notice she's talking about love. She's in this sentimental register. She's invoking religion. That is something that Equiano and Douglas do as well. They point out that slavery is unchristian, despite the fact that slave owners tried to use the Bible to justify their subjugation of humans into property. pointing out the hypocrisy of that practice is another common thread throughout slave narratives. Another thing that Jacobs talks about is destroyed virtue. Also in chapter 7, he would not love me if he did not believe me to be a virtuous woman. And then in chapter 14, alas, slavery held me in its poisonous grasp. There was no good chance for me to be respectable. So you could think back to what we've talked about with the cult of true womanhood. It's something that Jacobs invokes and she calls out to and points out that there's no way that an enslaved woman is able to be virtuous in a slave society. So that's one of the perversions of slave societies that she points out. I want to remind you guys of the seduction narrative that we have talked about a little bit before we talked about Wieland. It includes one character who fails to live up to the true woman ideal and at least one character who does live up to it. Like other works of the sentimental or domestic genre, it's characterized by tiers. It traces the gradual fall from innocence to experience. It has an overarching moral, which is important to mitigate against dissenters of women reading. So it can't just be a seduction narrative that seems fun, like, ooh, she was seduced, that was great. It needs to have some sort of a moral at the end of it, or it would not have been allowed to be published. And there were certainly things in the antebellum era that were too risque to be published at the time, but people wrote. There's even a book that you might be interested in called The Hermaphrodite by Julia Ward Howe. So playing with gender and the idea of binary sex even happened, still in the early 19th century. And the seduction narrative associates the tarnishing of chastity with other forms of pleasure, like having fun in public. So which of these apply to Jacob's incidents and which do not? That's a question that you guys might choose to ask in your pair chat if you want to. And I also want to bring up the idea of heteroglossia, which is a term from theory. Bakhtin uses the terms heteroglossia and dialogic to describe the quality of every text that is multiple, supple, irreducible to only one thing. That means it can never be reduced just to the author's intended message. Every text, he argued, is in dialogue with readers and their expectations. While Bakhtin said this was true of all texts, we can especially see this concept play out in incidents when Jacobs engages with at least two sets of generic conventions. So by that I mean she's engaging with the Gothic, she's engaging with seduction narratives, she's engaging with slave narratives. And so she's sort of inviting readers to think about genre and asking readers to kind of do a lot of work, kind of filling in some of the gaps there. So you can find a scene in which Jacobs addresses the audience and asks what sort of audience is she imagining or constructing. Does she imagine her audience to be abolitionists? Does she imagine them to be women? Look at the moments when she directly addresses the reader and glean from that what you think she's trying to construct for her kairos. Emplotment is another theoretical term that could be useful here. It was coined by historian Hayden White. He has a really long book called Metahistory, but if you want to just look up emplotment, you could find short essays on it. I'd be happy to help you work through this concept and give you some supplementary reading. If you're interested, you could send me an email. He describes how different histories can choose to emphasize different plots, different legible ways of interpreting a chaotic field of data. So we can think about how each of these writers emplot the history of slavery. And to give a little more context, White's Metahistory comes out in the 1970s. It's a really radical document for the field of history because historians generally saw themselves as like uncovering the truth. And White basically takes them to task and points out that histories follow narrative conventions. So there are heroic histories where there might be an underdog story, and there are satirical histories where power kind of turns on its head. And he gets into all of the different ways of telling a historical story, and he says it's not that there's no such thing as truth. He's not a pure relativist. But if we are given a bunch of different facts, we decide which one we're going to emphasize. So emplotment basically suggests that if we find facts A, B, C, D, and E, which might be different documents in an archive, it might be dates, it might be different perspectives on the same event, If we emphasize A, we're going to get a different story than if we emphasize C. And coming back to how that helps us think about Jacobs in respect to other slave narratives, Equiano emphasizes God over literacy and harm to family. He really engages a lot with the puritanical idea of providential signs throughout his narrative. And, you know, if you think about when he's writing, the end of the 18th century, it's still a moment where, you know, it's before the secular turn in thinking about uh, humanitarianism. A lot of humanitarianism is overtly religious. Obviously, that's still true to this day, but that's who Equiano is appealing to. Douglas emphasizes literacy. So for Douglas, learning to read is how he frees his mind, and freeing his mind is how he becomes free later. His entire narrative is, you know, one of the things that makes it so rhetorically beautiful, but also beloved by English professors to this day, is that emphasis on the importance of literacy. Jacobs emphasizes harm to family. And all of these elements are in all three of these narratives, but that emphasis changes the way that we think about the slave narrative as a genre. It changes the way that other techniques come in. So there's, you know, there are things that are painful and hard and torturous, obviously, in any slave narrative, but I would not say that they all include elements of the Gothic. Jacobs distinctively does have Gothic elements. She distinctively does have seduction elements. She is invoking fiction in a way that these other authors aren't. And it's interesting to think about how her emphasis on harm to family is part of why that happens. So I hope that that makes you think about the Gothic criteria of critiquing domesticity, because that's going to be a big part of her narrative as you read. So these are a few questions for your pair chat. As I said in my announcement, you guys can feel free to talk about Benito Cereno a little at the beginning of your discussion if you want to. I want to see at least 20 minutes devoted to Jacobs. You do not have to answer these questions. These are just there to help you get started, just so you have a place to begin. If you want, you can certainly feel free to ask different questions. But I think you might be interested to discuss when and why Jacobs invokes the Gothic. How does her narrative compare to other texts we've read for this class? How does her description of womanhood, for example, compare to Clara's or Phoebe's, or to Walter's idea of a true woman? How does Jacob's narrative change our understanding of the Gothic? This was something I mentioned before. How does it change how we think about the Gothic if we think of it as a technique that you use instead of the genre of the whole story? Do you feel differently about the Gothic after reading this narrative that only uses it occasionally to certain effects? What scenes would you like to analyze or discuss, and what other questions come up for you as you read? So hopefully this gives you enough to get started on the Jacobs. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you discuss in your pair chat, and I hope that you find this book valuable. I won't say enjoy it, because slave narratives are not meant to be enjoyed. They're meant to make us think, but I hope that you learn a lot from reading it, and thank you for your time.